Welcome back, everybody. In these times, I don't know about you, but I am definitely trying to make my food last as long as possible, which is why making your freezer your best friend may be a great option. So, here with all of the freezing tips we could use now more than ever to make sure that our food lasts as long as possible, we save money, and we also reduce food waste. We've got food expert and also food stylist, because that's a thing. Christine Tizzard joins us. Great to have you with us, Christine.
Hi,
Oh my goodness,
Christine.
I am so glad to be here with you, and I'm so excited to talk about my freezer.
Well, as Mel said, your freezer can be your best friend because it can really also help us save money. As soon as something is about to go bad, we can pop it in the freezer. It extends the life. It means we have more meals on hand. We can save more money. But just how do we know how long something can last in there?
This is a really good question. And I was actually really surprised to kind of figure this out too. Once you freeze something, it actually never really goes bad. So when you see in recipes or you see on packages, sometimes it'll say best frozen up to, say, 6 months. And this is because once something is frozen over time, it starts to degrade. It starts to lose its texture. It starts to lose some of its nutrients. It'll start to lose some of its flavor. So it's kind of really interesting, but the food never actually goes bad. What you'll start to see, and you'll especially notice this in things like frozen fruit, vegetables, you'll start to see little ice crystals start to form. Or on your breads and meats, you'll see something called freezer burn. And this happens when maybe you haven't stored your food properly in the freezer. Air gets in, nutrients gets lost, and those ice crystals starts to form, or dry bits, which we know as freezer burn. But the great thing is that freezer burn can actually be cut off. So it's still edible food. It just might not
Mm.
be as wonderful as it was up to, say, 6 months.
So it turns out that you keep some pretty interesting and perhaps unexpected items in your freezer that say we could use up in a recipe. So we're going to get to that in a second. As far as strange items in freezers, I have a snowball in a bowl that my daughter kept from last winter because she said it was the most perfect snowball she's ever made. So that's the most bizarre thing
That's
sitting in my
cute.
freezer. I want to know, what are the items in yours?
So a couple things that people might find a little odd is flour. I keep whole citrus in my freezer. I keep odd bits of things like ginger knobs and lots of herbs in my freezer as well. And then I always have a really nice big bag of vegetable scraps. I love putting my ginger in the freezer because these little knobs get lost in my fridge. And then when I go use them, they're all wrinkled up. But if you put them in the freezer, they'll stay fresh for way longer, and it's much easier to grate off, and you can just use what you need when you need it, which is great. And whole citrus is something very interesting that you can actually freeze whole citrus. It freezes really well. Most of the time we use things like lemons and limes for its juice anyways, and they're actually easier to juice once they're thawed. So it's a really great thing if you have a couple of these kicking around your fridge, you might be going away, pop them in the freezer, and then you have citrus juice whenever you want.
Well, speaking of citrus, since everybody is baking right now, you've decided to use your frozen citrus and make a lemon loaf. Tell us about it.
Yes, I always have an abundance of lemons also left over from work. So I have some in the freezer, and then every now and then I like to make my lemon loaf. So this is my spiced up version of a lemon poppy seed loaf. It's bright, it's tangy. The other great thing about it is that it's vegan. Whenever I want to go baking, sometimes I tend to go into my fridge and maybe there's no eggs left or someone drank all the milk. So keeping this vegan makes it really easy because I'm using ground chia and flax as an egg replacer, and I'm using a plant-based milk. I like to keep a couple Tetra Paks in my pantry, so whenever I run out of milk, I always have a backup plan. So if you ever run out of eggs, 1 tablespoon of ground chia or flax mixed with 3 tablespoons of water will give you 1 egg. So this is something that I make all the time, bright, tangy, some nice spices in there like cardamom and anise, and lots of those super seeds that we all love to have.
Christine, since you're talking about baking, you mentioned earlier that you keep flour in your freezer. Why do you do that?
Each one will have a best before date. Now, this best before date is good to keep in mind, but once your flour is opened, depending on how you're storing it, how well you're storing it, the temperature in your kitchen, like right now it's pretty hot in my kitchen because it's actually warm outside for a change, it'll start to degrade. And especially alternative flours like almond flours, whole grain milled flours, gluten-free flours, which are expensive. I don't want to take the risk of them degrading in my pantry, so I pop them in my freezer. And that way they'll last much, much longer.
Oh, that's interesting. You also mentioned that you hold on to vegetable scraps and throw them in the freezer as well. What are you talking about, and what then do
My
you use them
bag.
for after? I hear that there's a thing called stone soup, which I've never heard of before, and that's what they're helpful for.
Stone soup is an old, I don't want to say old recipe, but it's an old story about how you can make a delicious, flavorful meal out of basically nothing or little bits of everything. So with my stone soup, it's basically just a vegetable broth. And it's my way. It's like the easiest way to use up your vegetable scraps. Every time I make a meal, what I do is anything that I'm not going to be using or I consider a scrap or something that I would typically toss, I place it in my bag, and this goes in the freezer. And once my bag is full, I make vegetable broth. You just have to add water. It's free vegetable broth whenever you want it.
What are the best types of vegetables suited to this?
Any typical vegetable that you would use for a vegetable stock. So for example, right here, I have a bunch of stuff left over from this week. So I have my leek tops. I have my onion skins. I have a knob of ginger. I have some parsley stems. Carrots, also great. The ends that we always cut off and throw away. I have a nice celery stump here. This is perfect. I even have a fennel root here. So all of these things will make a really, really delicious vegetable broth. The only things you want to keep in mind is anything that, say, is bitter in flavor, like a hardy green, you might want to scale back on. Anything that is has a lot of pigment in it, like beets or cabbage, you might not want to add a lot of that because they'll turn your broth purple. But the other thing I want to say is that a lot of these things that we typically toss still contain a ton of nutrients, like onion skins, for example. The skins have a ton of flavor that we always just throw away, and also antioxidants.
Oh, I love that. Great tips. Fresh herbs are something that a lot of people have at the ready in the kitchen. But if you're not using everything, there's a way that you say we can actually freeze them to prolong their use.
For sure. I always have an abundance of herbs. I grow them in my garden. Plus, I always have stuff left over from work. So this is my top 2 ways of reducing your food waste when it comes to herbs. So hardy herbs, things like rosemary, lime leaves, lemongrass, sprigs of thyme, they can easily be frozen on the stem in a nice airtight packaging that can go in your freezer. So you can just grab what you need when you need it. For your softer herbs, like your parsleys, what I do is I chop them up and I freeze them in ice cube trays. Soft herbs will degrade faster in the freezer, but they will maintain their flavor if they're stored in some sort of oil or a fat. So I chop up my soft herbs, I put a tablespoon in each little compartment, and then top it up with some olive oil and place it in my freezer. So I know each one has a tablespoon of fresh herbs and I pop them out as I need them. So great way.
Hey, Christine, thank you so much for all of these freezing tips. And if you would like a recap, head to our website after the show. We'll be right back.